Hey everybody, welcome back for yet another lecture. We have a few more before this term is over, and then we're going to be moving on to other things. I'm already thinking about summer class. Maybe some of you are going to be my summer class. I'm taking in the lessons of what I figured out from this experiment in remote instruction. I'm going to make sure I get good feedback from you guys and then plan my summer classes. For now, today is day 70, a nice round number for a nice fascist discussion. So I want to talk about what I am and am not going to do today, because the topic of fascism is a really big one, and I'm not going to do full justice to the entire doctrine. I'm not going to talk about fascism either as a political system or as a kind of technique of political management, which is two different senses of fascism that are important. When I talk about fascism as a technology of political management, that's, when people talk about worrying about fascism, the fascist government, they mostly mean, I think that they mean to imply, not that we would have a fascist system as is discussed in this particular reading and as it was set up in Italy, but that there's a high level of manipulation and control of the population to essentially achieve, in a democratic system, authoritarian outcomes. And I think that that's an important component of what fascism is and why it's an interesting thing to talk about and dissect and pay attention to. That's actually a topic for a different class, a class that's more about power than than this class, which is about liberalism. I'm also not going to talk about fascism as a political system, as a doctrine for setting up a fascist state, because what fascism enters our class as, our conception, our consideration of liberalism, is a critique of liberal individualism. And so I'm going to focus today entirely on the critique. So one of the things I think that's useful about fascism, and one of the reasons why I include it in this class, even though some people, whenever I do this, are like, well, why is it relevant? Is it even relevant? The idea of the fascist critique could simply be that it shines some seriously harsh light on this notion of liberal individualism. And we can take seriously or acknowledge the incisiveness and the power of the fascist critique of liberal individualism without then having to embrace either fascism as a sort of technology of political management or fascism as a doctrine and a political system for setting up a nation state. So I believe that you can usefully separate out these three different facets of what fascism is, and so today I'm going to be just focusing purely on the critique. And what this means is that I'm not going to delve into a lot of the ideas that are in today's reading, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do all the reading. I do have, and I'm going to take just 1 second to make sure I'm recording. I am, just a little functioning paranoia there. I have some quotes I'm going to read that are entirely from the first couple pages of the reading. And that's because this is really the heart of where Mussolini gets into his critique. There's a lot of critique. I mean, there's a critique of socialism, there's a critique of democracy, but the beginning is where Mussolini lays out what it is that he thinks is wrong with the liberal conception of individualism, as well as why he sees it that way and what the fascist conception of the place of the individual in the universe is. Essentially lays out the fascist metaphysics, which is itself a direct critique of liberal individualism. Up to this point, we've seen a few critics of liberal individualism, and in a way, what the critics we've explored so far have said is that liberalism is missing something about the place of the individual in the universe, about the tighter relationship between the individual and society, or that there's a misleading aspect to the way that the liberal individualist picture states or misstates what it's like for human beings to actually exist in the world. The fascist critique is really more powerful than that. It actually says that the liberal individualism, the focus on the sovereign individual, is not just sort of incomplete or missing something, that it's completely misguided and that it gets things wrong, and that it's actually even more than it being kind of a sham, which it is from Marxist perspective. It actually just incorrectly conceives of what it's like to be an individual in the universe that we occupy, and pretty much takes down point by point what it is that the sovereign individual is supposed to be like and what is good about it. So I'm gonna read some quotes and then I'll discuss, and I'm really thinking that this is not going to be a particularly long lecture, though I know that when I've said stuff like that it ends up being over an hour, and then you're thinking, well, that's pretty long. So I'm just going to get into it and acknowledge that I'm hoping to be incisive today and concise, but not, who knows if that'll happen or not. Okay, here's what Mussolini has to say. This is on the right side of the first page. He calls fascism a spiritual attitude, and I do think that a big part of what the critique of liberal individualism is embodied in this, what I would consider to be the fascist metaphysics. He calls it a spiritual attitude, and here's what it is. Fascism sees in the world not only those superficial material aspects in which man appears as an individual. Okay? So our individualism is a superficial material aspect. It's true, but it's superficial. Standing by himself, self-centered, subject to natural law, which instinctively urges him toward a life of selfish, momentary pleasure, right? So natural law, which we can think of as our evolutionary hardwiring, instinctively urges us toward a life of selfish, momentary pleasure. It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law with common traditions and a mission which, suppressing the instinct for life closed in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life, founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. So there's a lot in that, and I'm going to unpack it here before I move on to another quote, but I just want to point out that this is really a completely different way of conceiving of what the universe is and what our place in it is. He's saying, okay, there are individuals, and they're in a superficial, materialistic way. They're exactly what how they've been described by liberals. They are self-interested, seeking their own pleasure, driven by sort of natural law, which hardwires our psychology to push us in a direction of essentially seeing our lives as all there is. There are other things, right? It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law with common traditions, okay, and a mission. So Mussolini is looking at the universe, and he's seeing a larger population of entities, right? And he's seeing the individual, but he's actually then placing it in relation to those other entities and saying, it is really, it's pretty much just it's a paltry thing. It's not that big of a piece, and it's certainly not what we should be looking at. In fact, if we're going to think of individuals at all, we have to see them in their context as part of these greater wholes. Okay, what is the mission? The mission is suppressing the instinct for life closed in a brief circle of pleasure. That's our instinct, right? That's what we're left with. That's at a superficial material level. That is, Mussolini acknowledges, what we are driven to pursue. That's essentially the liberal conception of the sovereign individual. The idea that we have a conception of the good, it's our own conception of the good, and we use our instrumental rationality to pursue that. He sees the same thing. He's not denying that that's true. He's just seeing that as actually a brief circle of pleasure. And there's a possibility, though, available to us if we renounce that instinct. And he notes that it's an instinct. He says instinctual several times in this passage alone, that we can get if we form the proper relation to the nation, the state, the generations, that we can get in which the individual by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. A life free from the limitations of time and space. Right? We free ourselves from our instinct, which pushes us to have a purely self-interested, pleasure-based existence. And that's the limitations of time and space. Right? Available to us is a higher meaning. And we're not going to get our higher meaning by essentially turning our interests onto our limited little selves. Now, here's another important quote that I'm just going to breeze past to get to the stuff that's on the other page. Fascism conceives of life as a struggle in which it behooves a man to win for himself a really worthy place. Right? And that worthy place is not clearly struggling to find your own form and find and pursue your own conception of the good. That is just accepting the limitations of time and space. That's accepting our kind of narrow, paltry little existence. And Mussolini doesn't talk about the sort of infinite span of time or the century span of the life of a nation or a culture. But one of the things I think that's implied here is that our lives as individuals are really paltry little quick things that just come and go very fast, right? There have been billions of years of not us before us. There's going to be billions of years of not us after us. And this tiny little wink, like how insignificant is it? If we just focus on ourselves, which is what the liberal individualist picture asks us to do, if we see these other entities as either non-existent or as primarily as a threat to our individualism, then we're going to forego and miss the opportunity to actually have a meaningful life, to actually have a spiritual existence in which our value consists. Right? I'll change sometimes the sexist language for this. Now, continuing on, following page, the fascist conception of life is a religious one. It's spiritual, it's religious, it's ethical. He uses a lot of terms to describe it. I'm going to say that it's pretty much all a metaphysical conception of our relation to the universe, right? We're clearly individuals, and there's no denying that. In a material way, we have our bodies, we have our minds, we have the ability to focus on our pleasure, we have all that stuff, but there's more available. The fascist conception of life is a religious one in which man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will transcending the individual and raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. Now, one of the things I think that's happening here is that Mussolini is positing as the true conception of the good a specific version. In past lectures, I know that I've talked about a variety of conceptions of the good that are available to people when they use their expressive or philosophical rationality, as I've called it, to decide what they're going to point their lives towards. And one of those conceptions of the good that I've mentioned several times is a spiritual oneness with all being. And that's a different thing, slightly different than what Mussolini's talking about here when he says, in immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will transcending the individual and raising him to a conscious membership of a spiritual society. But in a way, that is a conception of the good that in a liberal society, some individuals could come to that and say, yeah, you know what I really want to do is I really want to see what my relation to this higher law is. I want to seek this unity with a higher spiritual truth. In a liberal society, some people are free to embrace that. And what Mussolini is saying is that's actually the truth with a capital T. And the reason why it's the truth is because otherwise we're just paltry little specks of insignificant pleasure-seeking body. And that is really stupendously limiting, and if you stop to think about it. So what he's really doing here is he's making an argument that there is one conception of the good that is the correct one. And that's fundamentally anti-liberal, right, or illiberal, to say that there is one conception of the good that we must be moving towards. So he's really taking a strong stand on that particular thing. Okay, and he continues on. Man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, the nation. So we only have meaning insofar as we're a contributing member of one of these larger groups. And this is really just a way of saying that our individuality is an illusion, right? We're nothing as separate individuals. This is going farther than saying what the communitarians say and what the traditional conservatives say, and what Marx, I think, would say too, is that we are shaped by our social relations. We are shaped by the family, the culture, the society, the political system, and the economic system in which we're born and in which we're embedded, in which we live our entire lives. We are more than just shaped by it. We actually are meaningless without our relation to those things. And so instead of seeing society, other people, the government, corporations as a threat to us, as liberalism has as liberalism has advocated and encouraged, we need to see those things as the source of our only potential meaning, right? Or the only potential source of meaning. Maybe that wording it that way is a little clearer. So I'm going to continue on because I have a couple more statements for you before I then sort of unpack this stuff and really talk about why it is that this is a useful critique of liberal individualism and a set of ideas that liberalism needs to confront in order to be able to maintain the primacy of the sovereign individual at the center of political, economic, and social thinking. Anti-individualistic. The fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. And in a way, he's acknowledging that the liberal criticism of absolutism was important, right? You can't just say that liberalism, or you can't just say that any state or any power that can control individuals is fine, right? The liberal critique was that, look, these absolute states aren't serving to give us meaning. They're essentially just exploiting us. They're keeping us down. They're extracting from us. But that doesn't mean that the liberal conception of the individual, which is used to critique these absolutist states, is itself correct. It's a useful kind of momentary, contingent stance. But the fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. There was something that was true about these absolutist states that liberalism threw out when it critiqued them as essentially just being these exploitative power structures. Fascism doesn't seek to just reestablish the old regime. It seeks to reestablish the primacy of the state, but along particular lines. Okay, here he says, if liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individuals of liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. So he's actually saying, okay, liberty is at stake here. But it's not of the abstract dummy invented by individualistic liberalism. And in a way, that the whole notion of the abstract dummy really hits, because the picture that liberalism portrays of the sovereign individual is very abstract, and it is not meant to be descriptive, actually, of the way people really do live their lives. It's meant to be aspirational. It's a project. The liberal project is to say, well, these are good traits. We should be cultivating them. We should be cultivating our expressive rationality. We should be cultivating and strengthening our instrumental rationality. We should be cultivating the desire to come up with our own conception of the good and pursue that on our own without having to rely on family and culture and social pressure and government commands. He's actually just saying, no, that's actually not the pathway to liberty. The pathway to liberty, the pathway to a meaningful life that's beyond just our instinctual desire to live a life of self-interested pleasure, is to actually put ourselves in the service of something that's larger than us, something that has existed before us and that will outlive us for a long time. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarianism. Is totalitarian. So he's actually acknowledging that fascism is promoting a totalitarian state. There's no coyness about the fact that the state is going to be all things, that it will be a force fully shaping individuals and carrying forth all the power over how we think of ourselves, what we learn, how we live our lives, how we relate to other people. There's a nakedness to this admission that's, throughout this, Mussolini's not trying to make it look like this is a soft thing. It's a big thing. He talks about struggle, he talks about war. I'm not going to go into all the rest of that stuff, because that's trying to, I think that would go down the path of trying to make fascism seem like a compelling doctrine or a compelling political system. I'm not going to try to make that case. I do want to say a little bit more about making the case that the fascist metaphysics is a real challenge to the liberal metaphysics, which sees the sovereign individual essentially as the center and the end-all be-all, the thing that we should be prizing and valuing the most. Essentially, what liberalism sees as the peak of humanity, people taking their own lives completely into their own hands, shaping their own direction, the thing they're looking towards, their own moral and personal truth, their own identity, and embracing that as how they should live. He's saying actually that's garbage, right? That's not only not the highest thing, it's actually kind of garbage. That if you do that, what do you get? What do you get when you pursue the kind of existence that liberalism recommends for the sovereign individual? You get, essentially you're just ruled by this material instinct that is, does it come from you? No, it comes from outside of you. Does it serve you to have a meaningful higher life? No, it doesn't, right? There is this sort of false attractiveness to the liberal picture of how we relate to ourselves and our identity and our action and our choices, and how we relate to any other structure outside of ourselves: family, society, nation, state, culture, ethnic group. The challenge here is that I think that what is the meaningfulness that the liberal picture of the sovereign individual really does convey? Because Mussolini is saying it's essentially garbage, and it's a trap that takes you into a place where you have no meaning, and you have this short, brief, possibly pleasure-filled, possibly that you actually can serve your self-interest and live a fine, fun, materially satisfying, pleasurable life. But what are you really getting for that? And I think that it does raise the question of, why do we find it compelling to say my greatest use of myself is to form my own identity and beinghood by looking around and conceiving of what is good for me, with a capital G? What is my conception of the good? How can I determine, free of all of these other influences, or acknowledging all of the other influences, acknowledging the ideas, and actually seeking as many different ideas for what a conception of the good could be, and then ultimately weighing it. Like, one, are we even capable of doing that? Right? Is it even possible? But even if it is possible to kind of come to this freely chosen conception of the good, and then cultivate our critical thinking and our research skills and our pro-con evaluation so that we can instrumentally pursue that conception of the good, what do we get for that? What kind of meaning? Now, I think that one of the things that liberalism ultimately does ask us implicitly to set aside is the big question of what's the meaning of life. What is this life for? There's an implied answer. What this life is for focusing on ourself and conceiving of the time that we have here purely in personal, individualistic terms. But if you say, well, but yeah, what's the point of that? That line of questioning is essentially kind of denied. And Mussolini is opening up that line of questioning. What is the point of your narrow, paltry little life if you live it only in service to your own self? And there's a kind of a Rousseauian aspect of the critique too, where he's saying we're just following our instinct and we're being governed by natural law. And when you follow your inclinations and serve your own interests, really all you're doing, you're being a puppet of natural forces. That's what evolution wants from you. Evolution actually wants you to think only of your survival and moving your genes forward. But what's interesting about that is that evolution doesn't want anything, because evolution is not a conscious entity. But without having a consciousness, it pushes us in that direction. And it's actually, why does evolution want us to survive? It doesn't want us to survive on our own just for our own sake, because we're not going to survive that long. It wants us to survive so that we can pass our genes on to the next generation. That passing on is the only real purpose. That's why we have all these instincts. That's why we have this hardwiring. That's why pleasure exists in the first place, right? Pleasure exists to give us a motivation to, instead of just laying around, killing the little time that we have, not doing anything that's purposeful for the future, it incentivizes us to go out and push our genes into the next generation. So even though evolution doesn't have a conscious will, built into it is this transpersonal connection, right? Our actual hardwiring is an expression of the fact that we are transgenerational, transpersonal. We are not just a sovereign individual. And what I think Mussolini is asking us to do is to embrace the potentiality of not just having evolution get us to pass our genes into the next generation, but to embrace the notion that we have a part in this bigger picture, and that we can embrace that, and we should embrace that, instead of just calling that just a feature of our psychological makeup. Call that the spiritual opportunity that's available to us to actually put ourselves in the service of something larger. And what are the choices? The choices are: put your life in the service of your own bad self, or put your life in the service of something larger than yourself. And to Mussolini, really, you're going to just say, well, sure, no, I'll choose the path where any good that comes of the way I live my life is gone with my death and only is very limited to my specific interest. Or choose to have a larger meaning. Now, one of the things he does say that can, I think, really stick with people is he says, the mission is suppressing the instinct for life closed in a brief circle of pleasure, and then it builds up a higher life founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence. So self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, and death itself. That's a big ask, right? And it's, I think that the easy response, especially within a liberal society, is to be like, well, self-sacrifice, that's something, right? That could be part of a conception of the good. Self-renunciation, even just kind of recognizing that there's more to the world than just my impulses, my instinctual desires for pleasure. But death, you're asking me. And then later on you say it's a totalitarian system, so it's even like I'm turning over my entire will, all of my life in totality, my ideas, my actions, my relations to others, I'm turning that over to the state this higher entity. Part of the reason why I think that the whole death itself thing comes in, and why I focus on it, is we're all going to die anyway. And I think this is one of the things that kind of creates this ray of light for the fascist critique of the liberal individualist view. We're all going to die anyway. So, prolonging your life by avoiding death, by seeking to sort of maximize our amount of pleasure that we can experience, or to maximize our amount of service that we provide to others, or maximize our experience of serenity and social whatever it happens to be that we are, as liberal individuals, trying to do, that's all going to be over pretty soon. Why not die sooner as part of a meaningful whole, rather than die eventually and not that far away, right? And where all we've done is lived for our individualistic self. So there's a sense in which, like, you're going to die anyway, and your existence here on Earth is going to be brief. But there's no reason to lament that unless you don't see the possibility for connecting yourself to the things that have been here before you and that will be here after you. And that's why I think that Mussolini asks us to look around. He says, fascism sees in the world not only those superficial material aspects in which man appears as an individual, okay? It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country, individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions, culture, language, all of the stuff. If we open our eyes while we're here, we can see that the universe is not just populated by a number of other individuals who are also seeking their self-interest, and we're going to run into each other and compete and conflict, and sometimes we'll cooperate and get along and mutually satisfy ourselves through some kind of free exchange. That happens, that's there, but there's more. And since we're going to die anyway, we're gonna move quickly in and out of this play of self-satisfaction and seeking our interests. That makes me think about Shakespeare. All the world's a stage, blah blah blah. I wish I knew the soliloquy, but you probably know the concept. Like, this play of our life is so brief. We're gonna die anyway. What are we really giving up by deciding to put ourselves in the service of something that is higher, that's longer lasting, that has a permanence and a spiritual existence that we could never hope to have? That's the real question. And while I think that what the problem is that what fascism offers then is essentially total subservience to this totalitarian state, and whatever the mechanics of it are and how it all works, I think that's less important than the challenge of, since we do die, why does it make sense to live the time that we have in the service of our own self-interest? Now, liberalism doesn't require us to do that. And this is one of the things where I think that Mussolini, he oversimplifies what a liberal individualist society is about. It's not purely about people living for their evolutionarily pushed pleasures and self-interest. That's one thing that people can choose. That's one conception of the good, is living for yourself. There are other conceptions of the good that are available. That what Mussolini is saying is that of the available conceptions of the good, there's one that's right. There's one that actually gives us something big, something real, which gives us a larger meaning and a spiritual existence. So that one is the one that you ought to embrace. I think that the liberal response to this challenge is that, yeah, we're not here for very long. And yes, we die. But all we have is our own relationship to the universe. We are ultimately alone inside this mind, inside this body. And what we ought to be doing with our time here is actually looking around the universe and saying, well, what am I going to do with my time? What is a meaningful life for me? How do I choose to orient myself? This is the expressive or philosophical rationality. I think this is the important part of liberalism that often gets left out. The instrumental rationality, the self-interest, that's kind of a front and center piece of what liberalism is. But back behind that is always this notion that individuals are not just rational in the ability to move towards some good that is set before them, but that they have the ability to determine what that good is. And in a way, we get to make what we consider to be a meaningful life. Mussolini is saying, no, you can't do that without actually attaching yourself to something else that already has meaning that's bigger than you. You cannot generate meaning except by renunciating yourself and putting yourself into the total service of something that's larger than yourself. And if you don't find that compelling, that's where you can kind of fall back to the liberal notion of the sovereign individual. Like, as a sovereign individual, I don't have to turn myself over to my evolutionary hardwiring. I don't have to turn myself over to merely surviving and perpetuating my genes. I can actually look around the universe and see not just other entities like the nation and the family and multiple generations and the culture and the state. I can look around and I can actually see also a variety of different ways to give meaning to this fleeting existence of mine, to transcend the narrow confines of the brief time and the brief embodiment that I actually have on this plane. And I think that is valuable. It's like valuable to face the fascist challenge to the liberal metaphysics, because it much like, as Mill points out in on liberty, we have this doctrine that can get stale if we don't ever have to face challenges from it, even when we're facing challenges from ideas that are not true, right? Fascism is a great example of something that may not be true, but it actually kind of wakes us from our liberal dogmatic slumber where we just assume that the liberal individual is the most valuable thing and that we should be supporting it and cultivating it. It's a reminder that, wow, we need a reason. We need to be able to face this challenge. And I think that the reason that liberalism has to give back and that addressing this critique is a really energizing and empowering part of seeing what a liberal society is and why it is actually a valuable thing to cultivate and to protect, is that, yeah, meaning doesn't come automatically to us. And we do have this kind of metaphysical challenge that we're not here for very long, and we are hardwired to basically provide meaning for something else, just get our genes in the next generation. But we also have the opportunity to seek to create our own meaning in a universe where there's no automatic meaning for us, but two, there are a variety of options for how we go about doing that. So I do think that there's a pretty good answer from the liberal perspective to the fascist challenge. But it is also, I will admit, personally, it's hard to ultimately just say, yeah, that metaphysics, the fascist metaphysics, is just wrong. It's like it's not necessarily that wrong. It's a challenge to our individual-centric picture of the universe, and to address that direct challenge requires really seeing us as individuals, not just as self-serving individuals, but as seeking individuals. We are meaning-making. And this is not I would say, the standard conception of how we think about what liberal individualism is. Liberal individualism is really about tolerating people living their lives the way they want to live it, as long as they don't harm other people. And that makes a ton of room for people to live their lives according to the way that Mussolini thinks is kind of narrow and paltry, is to just, what's the brief circle of pleasure, right? Our self-fulfillment. But it also does create the opportunity when we don't get gobbled up by this state, this totalitarian state, it creates the opportunity for us to actually live our lives as meaning-seeking, meaning-creating beings. And so for me, then, that's the reminder that a really important core truth of liberalism is that if we're going to be truly sort of significant sovereign individuals, we cannot cast to the side or eschew or ignore the big task that expressive rationality sets for us, which is how do we express our individual existence through the conception of the good that we pursue. That is not just an afterthought or just something we do once and then we live our lives, doing with our instrumental rationality, seeking our self-interest and pursuing our conception of the good. But that it's a crucial task. And for that reason, I think that the fascist challenge is a really good one, because it highlights that the sovereign individual is not just a good pursuing machine. It is a good creating, good with a capital G. It is a conception of the good creating entity. And that's how we actually get our biggest spiritual meaning, is by determining what it is we're going to point ourselves towards. Now, we might, and this is the thing, we might point ourselves towards some larger community of interest or meaning, like the state, or like our family, or like an intentional community. Mussolini is saying he's going to pull us over and say, no, you have to serve the state. But we could accept this essentially metaphysical challenge that fascism lays down without necessarily accepting the sort of the political program that comes packaged together with it. So I see the challenge and the fascist metaphysics as being separate from a fascist political system or a fascist system technology of political management. All right, well, I could probably restate this in 5 different ways and take up another half an hour, but I think that the point is amply made. And so now I'm going to just end the recording and say, have a great weekend.